There was a scent of the future in the air that day, a smell of fresh paint, freshly cut grass, and new asphalt, blending with the sweet perfume of cotton candy and the metallic scent of newly erected structures. It was August 21st, 1954, and snow. Palo, a city pulsing with the urgency of becoming a metropolis, opened its arms to welcome its newest jewel, Ibirapuera Park. For little Clara, just 6 years old, the world was no bigger than the red balloon dancing above her head, a vibrant dot in a sea of gray, black, and white. Her big, curious eyes tried to absorb everything at once. The monumental pavilions that looked like spaceships from another world, sculptures that defied logic, and the crowd a river of people, moving with the energy of an event that promised to make history. Clara didn't understand the significance of the fourth centennial, but she could feel its importance in the firm grip of her mother's hand and in the proud smile of her father, who pointed at the architectural marvels with almost childlike enthusiasm. She was wearing a white lace dress with a satin ribbon at the waist and patent leather shoes that reflected the cloudy sky of Snow Palo's misty weather. She looked like an image of purity, a promise of innocence amidst the grandeur of concrete and ambition that surrounded her. The family had arrived early, eager to be part of the moment. Her father, an accountant who dreamed of the progress the city promised, described every detail to his daughter, explaining how those buildings, designed by an architect with a complicated name, represented tomorrow. Her mother, more cautious, kept a watchful eye, worried about losing track of the girl in that ocean of people. But the euphoria was contagious. The orchestra's music, the speeches from authorities amplified by loudspeakers that echoed, the sound of fireworks exploding in the daytime, all created a symphony of celebration. For a moment, vigilance relaxed. Clara, fascinated by a group of children chasing pigeons near the big lake, let go of her mother's hand. It was a quick gesture, almost imperceptible, an impulsive act, a search for freedom in a space that ironically celebrated human creative freedom. She took a few steps, the white dress standing out against the dirt ground. The red balloon floated. Behind her, her loyal companion. No one noticed anything unusual. She was just another child playing like so many others. Her mother turned to say something to her husband, a smile on her face, and when she turned back, the space where her daughter had been was empty. Her heart missed a beat. Where was the white dress? Where was the red balloon? The initial panic was silent, a wave of cold climbing up the mother's spine. She scanned the crowd, hoping to see Clara's dark-haired head somewhere. She called her name, first softly, then a little louder. The sound got lost in the cacophony of the celebration. Her husband, noticing the anguish on his wife's face, began searching as well, the smile now replaced by a mask of worry. They walked in circles, gently pushing through people, their eyes scanning every corner, every group of children, every family, but it was like searching for a drop of water in a river. The crowd was a monster with 1,000 heads, indifferent to the silent drama that was beginning to unfold within it. The scent of the future, which had once been so promising, now seemed laden with an invisible threat. The orchestra's music sounded distant and mocking. The gigantic pavilions, once symbols of progress, now seemed like cold, impersonal mausoleums, hiding a secret yet to be revealed. Somewhere, amidst the laughter of the people and the newly hardened concrete, Clara's red balloon must have slipped from her hand and soared into the sky, a solitary dot lost in the vast grayness. It was the first sign that something was irreparably broken. That day, which should have been remembered for celebrating the future, was about to become the starting point of an absence that time would never be able to fill. The celebration continued, but for that family, the world had stopped turning. The first call for Clara's name was a whisper of denial, a question thrown into the wind with the hope of an immediate answer, but no answer came. The second call was louder, filled with urgency, causing some heads to turn for an instant before. They went back to getting lost in the grandeur of the event. The father, now pale-faced, grabbed his wife's arm, a gesture trying to convey calm, but betraying his own growing despair. "She can't have gone far," he kept repeating more, to himself than to her. They began moving more systematically, pushing through the dense crowd. Every child in a light dress made their hearts leap, only to sink again in disappointment. The park, which just moments before had been a place of wonders, had turned into a labyrinth of anonymous faces and confusing paths. The sound of the celebration, the music, the voices became a white, oppressive noise, drowning out their increasingly desperate calls. They sought help from a guard, a man in an immaculate uniform, but with a gaze overwhelmed by the magnitude of the crowd he was supposed to monitor. He listened with professional patience, wrote Clara's name and the description of the white dress in a small notebook. "Many children get lost at events like this, ma'am. We usually find them near the candy vendors or the carousel," he said with a calmness that seemed almost cruel to the parents in agony. But there was no traditional carousel, only the art installations and the enormous pavilions. Clara's disappearance was no simple misunderstanding. It was beginning to take on a different weight, a darker texture. The father's colleagues, who had also brought their families to the inauguration, joined in the search. They formed small groups, spreading out in different directions with the promise of meeting near the obelisk in an hour. The news spread like a cold wind among the acquaintances. The accountant's daughter had disappeared. Some neighbors present at the event looked at the family with pity, while others whispered among themselves, remembering Clara as a quiet girl, always clinging to her mother's skirt. "She's so shy, she would never go with a stranger." One neighbor commented, unaware that her words only deepened the mystery dot as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the snow-polo sky with shades of orange and purple. The atmosphere of the search changed. Hope gave way to a palpable fear. The park began to feel like a cavernous void, one that echoed with the silence of what was now lost. The space slowly emptied, and the open areas that began to appear seemed vast and too empty. Every detail of the environment, once ignored, now took on a sinister meaning. A small satin ribbon found on the ground near one of the marquees made the mother's heart stop, but it was the wrong color. The partially open door of an exhibition pavilion, which should have been closed to the public, became a terrifying question mark. The father entered the dark space, the echo of his steps resonating in the vast emptiness, calling out his daughter's name in a hoarse whisper. Nothing, just the smell of dust and silence. Clara's absence was no longer just the lack of her physical presence. It was a void that sucked in the air, sound, and light around the family. Asterisk night fell over Ibirapuera Park, and the modern lights, which had illuminated the monuments, now cast long, distorted shadows on the ground. The shadows danced like ghosts, and in each of them the parents saw the silhouette of their daughter. The guard who had attended them earlier returned, this time without his professional optimism. His face was serious. He informed them that all the exits were being monitored, and no child matching that description had been found. Something was deeply wrong. The celebration was over, but the true horror of that day was just beginning. With the arrival of night, the party gave way to a different kind of movement. The colored lights that had celebrated the architecture now served a darker purpose, illuminating the tense faces of the first police officers who arrived on site. What had started as a private fear for the family officially turned into a case. The park, now almost empty, was cordoned off. The yellow police tape stretched between trees and lampposts, a gaping wound in the newly inaugurated landscape, a visual statement that the celebration had been profaned. Clara's parents were taken to an improvised room in one of the administrative buildings. The smell of reheated coffee and cigarette smoke lingered in the air, a brutal contrast to the festive scent of hours before. Sitting in uncomfortable chairs under the cold light of a single bulb, they repeated the story again and again to different men with the same tired and skeptical looks. Each repetition made the event more real and at the same time more unbelievable. The first statements were collected right there in the park among the cleaning staff and the last guards of the shift. No one saw anything, or worse, everyone saw many things, many children, many balloons. Clara's description, a 6-year-old girl in a white dress, was painfully generic on a day like that. The information was a blur of confused memories, useless fragments that led nowhere. Asterisk. The formal search began, methodical and cold. Officers with powerful flashlights walked in lines, sweeping the lawns, the edges of the lake, and the dark spaces under the marquees. Every bush was checked, every trash can inspected. Clara's absence began to feel, in a physical way, a pressure in the chest, a knot in the throat. For the mother, the silence of the park now was more terrifying than the noise of the crowd. It was a silence that swallowed the name of her daughter. The father, for his part, clung to a fragile rationality, trying to find an analog fault, an explanation that didn't involve the unthinkable dot it was during this nighttime. Sweep that the first concrete piece of the puzzle appeared, a small, desolate object. Near the edge of the lake, semi-hidden in the damp grass, one of the officers found a black patent leather shoe. It was small, delicate, with the metal buckle still gleaming under the flashlight's light. The father recognized it immediately. It was Clara's shoe. He felt the air leave his lungs. The object, so trivial just hours before, was now an artifact of loss, a tangible proof that she had been right there at that exact spot before disappearing. The discovery changed the dynamics of the investigation. The possibility that she had simply gotten lost and been taken in by another family began to dissipate, giving way to darker scenarios. Why would she be barefoot on one foot? Had she run? Had she been carried? The questions multiplied, each one more distressing than the last. One of the park guards, an older man who had been on duty near the lake in the afternoon, was called to testify again. He scratched his head, his face wrinkled with uncertainty. "I saw a girl. I think she was in white," he said, his voice hesitant. "But she wasn't alone. There was a man with her. He was holding a balloon, a red balloon. I thought he was her father." The statement fell like a stone in the silence of the room. A man, a red balloon, the balloon that Clara had been holding. But the father had been beside his wife from the very beginning. That man wasn't him. The night, already dark, suddenly became colder, and Clara's absence now had a face, an unknown shadow that haunted every corner of that monumental park. Revelation from the park guard fell over the small administrative room like the weight of a sentence. A man with a red balloon. The image, once a symbol of Clara's childhood joy, was instantly corrupted, transformed into an emblem of terror. Clara's father stood up abruptly, his face contorted in a mixture of fury and denial. "Impossible," he said in a hoarse voice. The balloon was hers. She was holding it. How could someone else have it? The detectives exchanged a glance. The father's logic was that of a desperate man, but the logic of the crime was different, more serpentine and cruel. That detail, the balloon, changed everything. The narrative of a lost child unraveled, giving way to the terrible possibility of a planned kidnapping, executed in broad daylight, amidst thousands of witnesses who saw nothing. The investigation, which until then had focused on the park as a labyrinth where Clara had gotten lost, now turned outward, toward the pulsating city that had swallowed the girl. The main contradictions settled into the heart of the family. Clara was a shy girl who didn't speak to strangers. How could she have approached an unknown man? Or worse, how had he taken her without a scream, without a protest that would draw attention? Doubt began to gnaw at the parents' certainty about their own daughter. Perhaps they didn't know her as well as they thought. Perhaps there had been a familiar face in the crowd, someone she trusted, someone they would never suspect. The mistrust, like a fine and poisonous mist, began to infiltrate the mother's thoughts. She mentally reviewed the guest list from the girl. Last party ... Clara single quotes S birthday. The faces of the neighbors, the husband's colleagues. Who could have had a motive? The police, in turn, worked with the limited tools of the time. There was no security camera system to review. Forensic. Science was rudimentary. The investigation relied on testimonies, and those testimonies were flawed, shaped by time, distance, and the fallibility of human memory. The focus of the search shifted to the man described by the guard, but the description was desperately vague. A man of medium height wearing a hat and a dark suit. In 1954, at a formal event like the park's inauguration, that description could have applied to hundreds, perhaps thousands, of men present. It was like looking for a ghost. The police began investigating the surroundings of the park, the streets, leading to the main avenues. Taxi drivers were questioned, bus drivers, kiosk owners. Had anyone seen a man with a crying girl? A man carrying a sleeping child? The answers were always the same. A shrug. I don't remember. The city, with its frantic rhythm, had already forgotten the celebration and moved on, indifferent to the drama it had left behind. The lack of concrete clues led to a new, painful hypothesis that the detectives were forced to consider. What if Clara had never left the park? What if the shoe found by the lake was not a sign of escape, but the final point of the journey? The possibility of an accident, of a fall into the lake, was raised. Divers were called in. For hours, under the anguished gaze of the parents, they searched the dark, cold waters. Every time one of them emerged, the silence was deafening, and the answer was always the same. Nothing. The investigation seemed to have hit a dead end, a labyrinth of contradictions. Had Clara been taken by a stranger, or by someone known to her? Had she left the park, or had she stayed in it, hidden somewhere terrible and silent? The lack of answers was a slow torture dot in the midst of this chaos. A decision was made, a last desperate attempt to find a new direction. The detectives decided to visit the family's home in the quiet tree-lined neighborhood where they lived. The idea was to search for something, anything, that could shed new light on the case. A diary that the mother might have, letters, a girl's drawings. Perhaps in the sanctuary of her own home, far from the public stage of her disappearance, Clara had left an echo, a silent clue about the fear she might have felt days before. It was a gamble, an attempt to dive into the recent past of the girl, hoping to understand her disappearance. Little did they know that upon crossing the threshold of that house, they wouldn't find answers, but rather the beginning of an even deeper and more personal mystery. The door to the house opened to a silence heavier and more oppressive than any noise. The air was still, impregnated with the familiar smell of home, which now seemed mocking. It was the smell of the breakfast Clara hadn't finished, the faint scent of soap in her bathroom, the smell of paper and crayons coming from her little room. Every object seemed frozen in time, a three-dimensional photograph of a life interrupted. Detectives moved with almost irreverent care, aware that they were intruding on a sanctuary of grief. While one of them talked to the father in the living room, the other accompanied the mother to the girl's room. It was a simple room, with walls painted a pale yellow, a neatly made bed with a patchwork quilt, and a small shelf with a few books, and cloth dolls. It was the room of a loved child, a space that exuded innocence. But it was this very innocence that made the mystery even Crueler. It was in this atmosphere of stillness and mourning that a secondary character, until then peripheral, gained a new and disturbing relevance. The neighbor next door, a widowed lady named Beatrice, who occasionally took care of Clara when the mother needed to step out, appeared at the door with a cup of tea, a gesture of solidarity. Her face was marked by concern, but there was something else in her eyes, a hesitation, a weight that didn't seem to be just compassion. As the detectives discreetly rummaged through the house's belongings, Beatrice sat down with the mother in the kitchen. At first, her words were comforting, clichés about faith and hope. But then, in a low voice, as if confessing a sin, she revealed something she had kept secret. "You know," she began, twisting a handkerchief in her hands, "in the last few weeks, Clara wasn't the same. She was scared." Clara's mother frowned. "Scared of what?" The girl hadn't said anything. Beatrice continued, her voice almost a whisper. She told that some afternoons, while playing in the yard, Clara would suddenly stop and stare at the street, at a dark car that sometimes passed slowly, almost stopping in front of the house. The girl never mentioned it, but Beatrice noticed. Even more disturbing was what she found under Clara's bed a week before the disappearance. It was a drawing different from the others, which were always full of smiling suns and colorful houses. This one was done with a black pencil, with strong, almost aggressive strokes. It showed a tall, faceless figure, a shadow with long arms, standing next to an empty swing. Next to the figure, scribbled in the uncertain handwriting of a child, was a name: the Whistling Man. Beatrice asked Clara who it was, but the girl simply ripped the paper from her hand, crumpled it, and started crying, asking her not to tell her parents. The neighbor, not wanting to cause trouble or seem alarmist, kept the information to herself, thinking it was just a childish nightmare, a fantasy. Now, that secret weighed on her conscience like an anchor. The revelation changed the atmosphere of the investigation. Clara's fear was not a fantasy. The Whistling Man was not a monster. Under the bed, he was a real threat, a presence that had been lurking in the girl's life for days, maybe weeks, before she was taken. The dark car, the shadowy figure from the drawing, everything connected in a terrifying way with the man in the dark suit. Seen at the park, the kidnapper was not an opportunist who acted on impulse in the crowd. He was a hunter. He had observed. He had planned. He knew Clara's routine, her fears. The investigation ceased to be about a single event and turned into a timeline about a silent pursuit that no one, not even the parents, had noticed. The pale yellow room, once a symbol of safety, now seemed like the setting for an invisible terror. Somewhere in that house, perhaps still existed the crumpled drawing, hidden at the bottom of a trash can or forgotten in a pocket. That piece of paper, once discarded as a childhood fear, now held the key, the face of evil that had stolen the innocence of that family. The truth was not in the park, but rather there, in the in-between of Clara's life, in secrets she was too young to share. The mention of the Whistling Man and the hidden drawing acted as a catalyst, redirecting the search within the very boundaries of their home. The search, which had previously focused on clues about Clara's whereabouts, now concentrated on finding an echo of her fear, a trace of her silent anguish. The father, the mother, and the detectives began a methodical and desperate search for the crumpled drawing. Every trash bin was emptied onto newspapers spread across the kitchen floor. Every coat pocket was turned inside out. Every crevice between the furniture was inspected. The house, once a sanctuary, had become an archive of pain to be deciphered. The smell of dust being stirred mixed with the scent of disinfectant, creating a sterile and melancholic odor. The predominant sound was of paper being rummaged through, the metallic click of drawers opening, and the muffled noise of footsteps on the wooden floorboards. The hope of finding the drawing, however, slowly dissipated with each room searched. It seemed that the small piece of paper with its dark secret had disappeared as completely as Clara herself. Frustrated, one of the detectives, an older and more experienced man named Arthur, decided to shift focus. If the drawing wasn't here, perhaps there was something else. He returned to the girl's room, sat on the edge of the small bed, and let the silence of the room speak to him. His eyes slowly scanned every detail: the row of cloth dolls sitting on the shelf, the flowered lampshade, the small music box on the dresser. It was then that he noticed something. The music box was a simple object of dark wood with a ballerina on top. Clara's mother confirmed it was the gift from her last birthday. Arthur carefully picked up the box. It was heavier than it seemed. He rotated it in his hands and noticed that the bottom was slightly loose, as if it had been tampered with. Using the tip of a pocket knife, he gently pressed, and the false bottom opened. Inside wasn't a drawing, but something equally revealing and much more disturbing. Folded into a small square was a piece of candy wrapper, the kind sold at cinemas or candy stores. On the back of the paper, written in the same hesitant, childish handwriting, was a single word: garden. Next to the word, a small circle with an X in the middle, like a rudimentary map, but it wasn't their house's garden. Clara's father, upon seeing the paper, felt a shiver run down his spine. He recognized the type of candy wrapper. It was from an imported, expensive brand, sold only at one place in the city at that time, the candy shop in front of the old Cinemetro in downtown São Paulo, a place they rarely visited. Why would Clara have that paper, and what did garden mean? The word seemed to float in the air, laden with an ominous and hidden meaning. It wasn't a garden of flowers, it was a code, a clue left behind. The whistling man hadn't just been watching her from afar. He had approached her. He had given her a sweet. He had established contact, created a secret between them. The quiet discovery inside the music box changed the course of the story once again. The investigation, which had moved from the park to the house, now pointed to a third location: the pulsing, anonymous heart of the downtown area. Clara's fear wasn't just a presence in the street or a figure in a drawing. It had a taste. The taste of an expensive sweet she shouldn't have had. The atmosphere in the house grew even denser, almost suffocating. The innocence of the music box, with its frozen ballerina, had been violated, transformed into a hiding place for a terrible secret. The silence that followed the discovery was not one of peace, but of dread. The truth was approaching, and every step toward it seemed to lead to a darker place. The mystery was closer to being unraveled, and the realization that Clara wasn't just a passive victim, but someone who held a clue, made everything even more terrifying. She hadn't simply been taken. Somehow, she had been trying to tell them where the word garden written on the candy wrapper echoed in everyone's mind. An enigmatic cipher that seemed to mock the intelligence of the adults. What did a park mean? Jardim da Luz? Jardim America? São Paulo was a mosaic of neighborhoods and streets with flowery names. And the clue seemed too broad, too vague. The frustration was palpable. It was Clara's father, in a moment of painful clarity, who broke the silence and immobility. His eyes, which had been lost in the void until then, suddenly focused with sudden and terrified clarity. He stood up, walked to a cupboard in the living room, and pulled out an old photo album. His hands trembled as he flipped through the yellowed pages, passing by images of picnics, birthday parties, and family outings. He stopped at one particular photograph. In it, a group of his office colleagues smiled for the camera during a year-end celebration. Standing a little apart from the group was a man in a dark suit, a hat, and a faint smile, almost invisible. "This man," said the father, his voice faltering, pointing to the figure in the photo. "His name is Marcius. He worked with me for a few months last year. He was fired for inappropriate behavior. Nothing serious, just strange. He was very reserved, but sometimes he whistled. A low melody, always the same. Detective Arthur took the album, his gaze fixed on the man's face. The description matched. The connection, once unthinkable, now materialized before them in black and white. The whistling man wasn't a complete stranger. He was a former coworker of Clara's father, someone who had access to information, who knew where the family lived, who had probably seen Clara before. The boundary between the safe world of work and family and the world of the unknown predator had completely broken down. The evil hadn't come from outside. It had been inside, disguised as normalcy, sitting just a few tables away. Clara's mother, upon hearing the name Masha's, raised her hand to her mouth, her face contorting into a mask of horror and recognition. She remembered. Masha's had only been to their house once, months earlier, to drop off some documents for her husband. Clara had been playing in the living room. He greeted her, smiled at her. Her mother remembered finding his gaze a little too intense, a little too lingering on the girl, but dismissed the feeling as an exaggeration on her part. Now, that moment, that brief encounter, reconfigured in her memory like a scene from a horror film. He had been in their house. He had seen their daughter. The guilt hit her with the force of a physical blow. How had she not noticed? How could she have allowed that man near her daughter? Emotional chaos took over the room. The pain of loss mixed with the rage of betrayal and the paralyzing guilt. The father, once a figure of rationality, now seemed to crumble under the weight of his indirect connection to the disappearance of his daughter. A burden too heavy to bear. And then the word garden made sense. Detective Arthur, who was investigating. Macias's background, while the family drowned in their own despair, made the final connection. After being fired, Macias had taken a temporary job as a janitor. His new workplace was a small commercial building in downtown, an old and somewhat decaying building. The name of the building, engraved in faded bronze letters above the main door, was Edificio Jardim, garden building. The break in reality was total and brutal. The clue wasn't about a park or a neighborhood. It was an address, a specific location. Clara hadn't been trying to name a place. She had been trying to name the person. The garden was the whistling man. He had become the place. The realization that Clara, in her innocent 6 years, had created a code to identify her captor, a code they had finally deciphered, was both a relief and a terrible omen. The search was no longer blind. They had a name, a face, and now a destination. The fragile and nearly extinguished hope reignited, but it burned with the urgency of fear. They knew where to go, and the thought of what they might find there was almost unbearable. The car ride to the downtown area was made in dense, heavy silence. The snow polo night, with its neon lights and the incessant movement of vehicles, passed by the windows like a blurry silent film. Inside the car, the only sound was the restrained breathing and the hum of the engine. Clara's parents were in the back seat, a chasm of silence between them, each lost in their own hell of guilt and fear. Detective Arthur drove with professional calm, which violently contrasted with the emotional storm unfolding around him. The revelation about Macias and the Edificio Jardim had transformed the vague anguish into specific terror, a concrete target where all the pain and hope now converged. The atmosphere was claustrophobic, as if the air inside the car was becoming rarer, too heavy to breathe. As they arrived at the street of the building, the city seemed to retreat. It was a narrow, poorly lit street lined with commercial buildings, their dark facades resembling closed eyes. The Edificio Jardim stood out with its abandoned appearance. The peeling paint, the dusty windows, and the faded bronze letters of the name gave it the look of a mausoleum. There was no sign of life, except for a single light on in the ground floor, probably at the doorman's desk where Marcius was supposed to work. The narrative, which had begun in the vast, sunny, and festive park Ibirapuera, now funneled to this final point. A dark, forgotten place in the heart of the metropolis. The approach to the unknown was a slow torture. Each step the detectives took on the cracked sidewalk echoed in the silence of the street, amplifying the tension. The main door of the building was locked. Arthur knocked hard, the sound echoing through the empty hall. No answer. He and his partner forced the lock, which gave way with a metallic snap that sounded like a shot in the stillness of the night. Interior was even more desolate than the exterior. The air was stagnant, filled with a strong smell of mold, dust, and cheap cleaning products. A single weak lamp hung from the ceiling, casting long, ghostly shadows that danced with every draft. The janitor's small office was empty. There was a newspaper of the day, open on the counter, a half-finished cup of coffee, and an overflowing ashtray. Marcius had been there, and had left in a hurry. The fear that they were too late, that the predator had already escaped, settled in the stomachs of everyone. It was then that Clara's father noticed something on the floor near the door, leading to the back of the building. It was small, red, and nearly deflated. Piece of rubber, a balloon, the same red shade as the balloon Clara had held at the park. Seeing the object was like a punch to the gut, a brutal confirmation that they were in the right place. That piece of latex was the signature of the monster, the final proof that he had brought his victim to this decrepit place. The emotions that had been contained exploded. Clara's mother let out a muffled sob, a mixture of horror and a flicker of hope that her daughter might be alive somewhere inside. The father, driven by a wave of adrenaline and fury, pushed the back door open, ignoring the detective's warnings. The door opened to a dark hallway that led to a descending staircase, a staircase that plunged into the darkness, into the building's basement. From the depths of that darkness came a different smell, a sweet, metallic odor, the smell of something hidden, something terribly wrong. The physical approach to the secret was complete. The next step would be into the dark, toward the heart of the nightmare. The descent down the stairs was a plunge into pitch blackness. The detectives' flashlights cut through the dark with trembling beams of light, revealing damp walls from which dark sludge leaked and broken cement steps. The air grew colder and denser with every step, and the sweet, metallic smell intensified and nauseating, odor that clung to the throat. The basement corridor was a maze of rusted pipes and storage rooms locked with heavy padlocks. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of their own steps and the constant drip of water somewhere nearby. Clara's father led the way, driven by a strength he didn't know he had, the name of his daughter, a silent mantra on his lips. Clara's mother followed closely behind, supported by one of the officers, her face pale as wax under the artificial light. At the end of the corridor was a single metal door, different from the others. It didn't have a lock, just a simple handle. It was ajar. A faint line of light seeped through the crack. Arthur signaled for everyone to stop. He drew his gun and, with a quick movement, opened the door completely. The scene that unfolded was so shockingly normal that for a moment it seemed unreal. It was a small, improvised room, Marcius's bedroom. There was an unmade single bed, a small table with a dirty plate of food, and a radio emitting low static. In one corner, hanging on a hook, was a dark suit, and on the bed, sitting with her back straight and her eyes fixed on nothing, was Clara. She was wearing the same white lace dress, now dirty and wrinkled. She was barefoot. In her hands, she held the small porcelain ballerina that had been torn from the top of her music box. She wasn't crying. She wasn't speaking. She simply stared ahead, her face expressionless, like a wax doll. The relief that flooded her parents' chests was so overwhelming that it left them breathless. A wave of emotion so strong that it made them stagger. The mother ran toward her daughter, calling her name in a cry that was a mixture of joy and pain. But Clara didn't react. She didn't turn. She didn't blink. It was as if the sound didn't reach her. The father, approaching, saw the reason. Next to the bed, on the floor, was an empty syringe and a small glass vial. Machaz had kept her sedated, trapped in a chemical silence, a prison within her own body. The truth appeared in a brutal way, not with a body, but with an absence within a presence. She was there, but at the same time, she wasn't. The connection between all the elements of the mystery finally made sense. The whistling, the car, the candy, the drawing, the garden, the balloon, were the traces of a meticulous predator who had built a web around the girl. Nashus was not in the room. He had fled, probably upon hearing the movement upstairs, leaving. Behind his victim and the evidence of his crime, the euphoria of the rescue was quickly replaced by a new kind of horror. The mother's collapse was silent, a crumbling of knees to the cold floor, her face buried in her hands. The father simply stood still, looking at his catatonic daughter. Anger and relief waged a battle inside him, leaving him paralyzed. The girl was alive, physically intact, but something in her eyes had broken. The mystery of her whereabouts was solved, but a new and perhaps deeper mystery was beginning. What had happened in that dark room? What horrors had she witnessed, locked? And her forced silence? A full weight of the revelation fell on them, but it did not bring catharsis, only the chilling realization that the rescue was only the beginning of a much longer and darker journey. The evil had been found, but its shadow would remain over Clara forever. Machaz was never found. He dissolved into the vastness of the city, becoming a ghost. A footnote in police files, a name whispered in nightmares. For the world, the case was considered a success. The little girl kidnapped from Park Ibirapuera had been found alive. But for the family, the word success was a cruel irony, an empty echo in a house that would never be the same. The vibrant girl who had been enchanted by a red balloon had been replaced by a quieter, paler version, whose large dark eyes seemed to observe the world from a great distance, as if she were trapped behind an invisible glass. Clara's father buried himself in his work, seeking escape from the guilt that gnawed at him through the cold logic of numbers. The image of Machaz's face in the company photo album haunted his nights. He had brought the monster close to his family, even without knowing it. Every smile from a colleague, every polite gesture from a stranger, was now filtered through permanent distrust. The mother, in turn, devoted her life to trying to rebuild her daughter. An exhausting, often fruitless effort. She filled the house with color, music, and life in a desperate attempt to erase the shadows of Edificio Jardim. But Clara's silence was an impenetrable barrier. The love that united them as a family remained, but it was transformed into a vigilant, anxious love, forever marked by the fragility of the security they had once taken for granted. Time passed. Edificio Jardim was demolished years later to make room for a modern, soulless parking lot. The basement room, with its damp walls and secrets, was reduced to dust and rubble, its memory erased from the urban landscape. Park Ibirapuera flourished, becoming the green heart of Snow Paulo, and the story of the missing girl at its inauguration turned into an urban legend, told in increasingly distorted tones, getting lost among the thousands of other dramas of the metropolis. Went on relentlessly, as it must. Clara grew up, became a woman, but the 6-year-old girl remained frozen in that basement, holding the porcelain ballerina. Decades later, as an elderly woman, Clara's mother found, at the bottom of an old sewing box, a small object she had, kept without knowing. It was the patent leather shoe, found by the lake that distant night. The leather was dry, and the buckle was oxidized. Holding that small artifact felt like holding the last trace of the daughter she had lost, not to death, but to silence. That same afternoon, she watched Clara, now a middle-aged woman, sitting on the porch, watching the rain fall. Her eyes had the same empty expression they had that day in the basement. Suddenly, almost imperceptibly, Clara began to whistle. It wasn't a joyful melody, but a sequence of low, repetitive, and melancholic notes. The same melody her father had described so many years before. The smell of fresh paint and future from that 1954 day had long since dissipated. The echo of the whistle of a faceless man proved to be eternal.